Good morning. My name is Walter Grayman. I'll be moderating this webinar. I'd like to welcome all of you to this, our second in a series of webinars organized by the EWRI Premise Plumbing and Modeling Task Committee. I'd first like to thank USEPA for hosting this and all of our webinars. During the webinar, we ask that everyone mute their microphone except when they're speaking, and also please mute or turn off your cameras to save some bandwidth just in case. During the webinar, you can ask questions or make comments by going to the chat pane, and we will monitor that, and time permitting at the end, we'll try to respond. If we don't, we'll be logging those comments and we'll respond afterwards. The purpose of the task committee that's been formed since sometime last year is to advance the science of the new field of premise plumbing modeling. We'll be documenting the state of the art, determining the future research and development needs, and preparing a report and other mechanisms for disseminating the information. In order to carry out our work, we've defined 9 specific focus areas. And those are listed on that slide. And each of the focus areas will hold a webinar approximately monthly. And we have the dates shown there, at least for the first 2, and then approximate for the other ones. They'll also be the focus for preparing the specific chapter on those topics for the final report. If you want more information or to add your name to our email list, if you received an invitation specifically from us to attend this, then you're on our email list. If you're not, we hope that you let us know so we can put it on the list so you'll know what's going on. June Suk Lee from Manhattan College is the task committee chair and is going to be our point of contact for the committee. We have 5 presentations, about 10 to 11 minutes each, and I'm going to ask each of the presenters that when they first come on, give a very brief bio, or at least what your affiliation is. We will hold the discussion until the end of all the presentations. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin Lanzi and Sasha Shook to give their presentation.
This is Kevin. I'm at the University of Arizona. Sasha is a former student who worked here, a really good student who worked with us as on his master's degree. And Sasha, if you could advance one, please. His thesis goals were to look at a premise plumbing system, in particular a residential premise plumbing system, and recognizing that you get rid of a lot of water in a premise plumbing system really fast with a toilet flush, and water moves pretty quickly. So that's just some numbers there at the bottom of the page. So what we try to look at is, can we look at a design of the system to reduce the water age, only water age, not full contaminant modeling, and see if there's some better practices than just throwing things together as an architect normally would. We also looked at the impact of hot water heater on overall water age as well. So I'm going to shift this now to Sasha. He's going to go through some of the analysis and results, and I'll come back and talk about some further conclusions.
Well, thanks so much, Dr. Lanzi. So I'm going to start talking about the methodology. We needed like 3 major components. The first one was the premise water distribution system. I'm going to talk more details about that on the next slide. But we also needed an hydraulic model that was capable of calculating water age in pipe flow. For that, we used EPNet coupled with the MATLAB toolkit. And the third major component we needed is the demands, for which we found on the literature the model by Blocker, which is called Syndium, which we had to code in MATLAB with some modifications. We added splitters to have demands on fixtures of the same type. And we also added a hot and cold splitter which we assumed a target temperature, and we achieved that temperature by mixing cold and hot water with the objective of having hot water demand as well. We ran the simulation for a 90-day period using a 1-minute time step. We considered H0 at the meter, as you can see here. And as Dr. Lancy mentioned, we considered 2 types of water heaters, a traditional or tank heater and a tankless or on-demand heater. I want to see if I can turn on the pointer. Okay. So what we compared, as I mentioned, the objective was to change the layout of the premise plumbing system to see if we can improve water age. For that purposes, we tried with 2 different houses. The first one is smaller. It's only 1,300 square feet. It's 2-story, and we assumed 4 residents for that one. And we tried 5 layouts. House 2 is a little bigger. It's single-story, and it has 5 residents, and we tested 3 layouts. So the other thing we tried, as we mentioned, is that we swapped the traditional tank heater, which we modeled using a first in, first out for the water age, for the water particles. And we swapped that with an on-demand, which is no tank water heater at the same location, basically. And what we did is that we designed the premise plumbing system to meet the 2012 International Plumbing Codes criteria. So this is just to show you real fast the 4 layouts for house number 1. The first one is just the baseline real design. The second one is pretty much the same as the first layout, but we put the toilets at the end of the branches to test the hypothesis that a good toilet flush will be able to flush or pretty much remove the old water from the system. The third one is a 1-branch system, whereas 4 and 5 are multiple branch systems. And the same approach was followed for the second house. The first one is a real design. The number 2 is just basically trying to connect the toilets at the end. And a similar approach was followed for the third layout. So what did we measure? So we computed water age at 2 locations. The first one is the fixture outlet, which is shown here, which is just basically when the water leaves the system at the tap. And the other point was at the point of connection with the premise distribution system, which is point number 2. And both are connected by this stop pipe. We looked at 3 statistics, the household maximum, which is the maximum residence time for all fixtures in the household, the mean fixture maximum. So what we did for this one is that we calculated the maximum water age for every fixture, and then we took the average of the maximums. Whereas for the last statistics, the mean over time for all fixtures, which is just the mean for all fixtures over the simulated period for all time steps. So I'm going to jump into the results and conclusions. What we can see here on the left is the results for house number 1, cold system at the fixture outlet. So at this point, and on different colors, we can see we can see the 3 statistics in different colors for different layouts. So you can see that regardless of the layout, we're basically observing the same results with slight variations for the mean fixture max. However, if you look at the results at the connection point, which would be here, you can see that there is a massive decrease in pretty much all the statistics we looked at between the best, which is the orange one with the lowest water age, the best layout, and the worst one with the yellow one. So that leads us to the conclusion that you can actually reduce water age just by changing the layout of the distribution system. However, these stub pipes are acting as dead ends, and these are the cost of worst water ages if you compare the two graphs. However, the volume of those pipes is pretty small, which leads us to conclude that the volume of water with high water age is also very small. So for reference, one of these stub pipes can have usually something close to 3.8 ounces, which is very small. So on the left side, I'm showing basically exactly the same results for house number 2, and the conclusions are pretty much the same. We can reduce water age by changing the layout. And if you compare the first layout against the second one, if you remember, they were pretty much the same, but we connected the toilets at the end of each branch. And we can see that this is like an effective way to reduce the water age at the distribution pipe. And here on the right side, I'm showing you the results for the hot water system. This is using a tank heater, so you can see that the residence time is way higher, and that's because the high volume of the tank heaters. But I'm going to talk about that on the next slide on this one. So for house number 1, what I'm showing here is the reduction for all the statistics when you swap the traditional tank heater with a tankless one on the same location. So this is the percent reduction for the 3 statistics for the 5 layouts. So the graph is slightly changed from the previous slides. And on the gray box, I'm just showing you the mean over time at fixtures statistic for both the fixture outlet and at the connection point. And in gray, the bar is showing you the reduction between, as I said, the tank heater from going to the tankless heater. So the conclusion here is that you can significantly reduce the residence time by swapping the traditional tank heater with a tankless one. Do you wanna? Oh, sorry.
Yep. So one of the major things that we ran into when we tried to do this was Pasha recognized early on that EPA net is probably not the right tool to be using for the hydraulic side of EPA net is probably not the right tool to be using for this analysis. EPA net does not allow the flow to go to 0. So what happens, and this is looking, the figure on the right shows the water age that's coming out of EPA net after over a day when you have no flow coming out of node 4. You can see a small flow that's being sent through the pipe, and this shows that water age is increasing over time, but in actuality, we're getting no flow down there. So using EPA net is so if you can go ahead one slide, Sasha, please. So using EPA net is probably not the right algorithm for this, and I'm sure KY Pipe and Kentucky people are jumping up and down right now saying, yes, you should be using the node loop equations to be able to solve this and get rid of that 0 flow. So we should be looking at some alternative model. We came up with a solution that was pretty tedious to work through by increasing the demands and increasing pipe sizes to make this work. So that's really number 1. That's a major thing, a major change, and I really hadn't thought about that until last night, that KY Pipe could handle this right off the bat. In addition, this stub issue is really where the rubber hits the road, I guess, and we really need to understand what's going on in microbial at those points. Is it in the water? Is it on the pipes? Can we flush it out with the water? Extending this work directly, we think looking at looping systems to try to move water through, primarily because we don't know which fixture is being used in the house. We assume that they were uniformly used. So some toilets, for example, may not be used for a long period of time, and we need to get them to flush. We can use the auto flush. I know there's some out there on the market for cats that you could cause your toilet to flush every now and then to reduce ages as well. So volumes, if we would also be an issue if we could look at risk analysis to look at volumes of water that's being contaminated. So there's a whole range of issues you could look at, but we think we need a more efficient model than what we looked at, and to speed things up. So you could read these, and I'll leave it at that point. And Walter, you could take over.
Thank you very much, Sasha and Kevin. They're very interesting, and thank you for staying in your time limit. Let's go ahead right on to John Burkhart. Grab the screen and give your presentation.
All right. Hopefully everybody can see my screen. My name is John Burkhart. I'm with the US EPA Office of Research and Development, and I'm leading the premise plumbing modeling group here for a few different topics. I'd like to thank my co-authors here for all the help they put in, and as always, this is my opinion, not the opinion of the agency. And just before I dig into it, I'll talk about EPA Net 2.2, which addresses some of the issues that Kevin raised. We recognize that a couple years ago when we started this work as well, about the stagnant flow. And I've included a number of slides that are just more informational, and I'm happy to follow up with anybody, but I'm going to sort of breeze through some of the background. And so we developed an agent-based model, demand generation model, that was deterministic, not probabilistic, although probabilistic is in our future. And we were using Monte Carlo approaches to look at the effect of these pseudo-realistic usage patterns on different numbers of people. So one of the big issues that we wanted to test our demand model, but we also wanted to look at, what's that interuse frequency. A lot of people will just take the total number of uses, divide that into the hours in the day, and they get, somewhere around 30 minutes. And so I wanted to sort of demonstrate, is that correct or not, and how that changes. So we did look at some of the other models, although we did at least initially decide to use our own. But again, highlighting some of the work that had already been done, and we're actually talking about that more today. Other work that we've done using the premise plumbing models looked at the lead. We have a lead modeling system in our building, and we've been modeling that, and we also have been looking at the impact of dispersion. So that was another side topic which we'll potentially highlight in a later webinar series. So again, as our last speakers talked about, we broke everything down into different fixtures, dishwashers, toilets, and we applied different models for each of those, or usage groups. We modeled it at 10-second intervals to try to get as fine a gradation as possible on the uses. And then we have some EPA Net input files based on two houses. My house and one of my colleagues, we actually measured all the pipes, and we used those for the talk today. But again, very similar, and again, highlights what was talked about in the last slides, that the layout can play an impact on water age. And so again, I'm going to sort of skip through the next couple slides. Again, I'm happy to talk about these, but they're not really, we'll be talking about those next month in a webinar series about demand estimation. And so we used EPA Net 2.2 with water age. And again, similar to the last talk, this is relative age, just from the water main in the street. Each of these 360 random scenarios were generated for 1, 2, 3, and 4 people. And we also looked at the impact of what if you had larger pipes in a house, although most houses are plumbed with half-inch. And then we also applied high or low water use fixtures. So if you have a house that maybe has fixtures or appliances that use more water or less water, how would that impact it? And we also, similar to the last speaker, looked at hot water heater as a source of where water age accumulates. So this is just comparing the results for the house 1 versus house 2. And so generally, as we would expect, we see as more people live in the house, you have more uses, and because of that, you then get a decrease in average. In this case, it's being plotted the drinking water age, and so the median for four, people, each of them has about the same likelihood of getting, 1 hour old water for drinking, whereas for one person in both houses, you're getting about 3.5 to 4 hours as a median for drinking water. Again, relative water age. Okay, so on this slide, we have the cold versus hot water age. Again, sorry for the technical difficulties on my part. And so on the left there, we have cold water use. And again, similar as to what was plotted in the last slide, you just see, generally as more use or more people are in a house, the uses move earlier in age. Interestingly, on the cold water use, the home uses, which would be dishwasher activities or washing machine activities, are going to have a high probability of very low age because of their high total volume. Whereas on the hot water side, you see home uses are now on the right. And again, because they're experiencing a lot of volume, but from the hot water heater. And so we use the CSTR approximation in EPA net rather than the FIFO as the last speakers. But again, we can compare and contrast the impact of the hot or cold water use. Next slide. And so again, this is now just comparing the 40-gallon versus 50-gallon. And we can see even that 10-gallon difference in total volume of the hot water heater. It does change the likely age of the water. And again, these are having the same patterns applied, but just changing the hot water tank size. Next slide. And so this one again is now highlighting the high versus low water use. So if the fixture had high or low GPM or total volume used. And again, for 1 or 4 people, big things for this, showers again tend to have very low age, just simply because of the total volume used. And there's subtle differences between the, again, 1 to 4 people. You're generally reducing the age that's experienced for different activities, and then also with the higher use volume per use, you're getting a decrease in water age. Next slide. So I think this is the last example, but this is, again, trying to show a similar plot to what was shown in the last presentation, which is the maximum experienced water age for, again, a drinking water activity. And so we can see that the work and overnight stagnation periods are highlighted. They're both around 8 hours. But I want to note the shift in scale where the max day versus mean day, the median is even for 4 people in that stagnation period, as we might expect. So one user in one simulation could experience that max stagnation of water, even with 4 people. Next slide. And so the big conclusions from this, again, just similar impacts, number of people that are in a home, number of activities will impact the water age as we would expect. The type of fixture can also have a subtle impact. And then also just the max relative water age that a person could experience, at least, occasionally can encounter that max stagnation or long stagnation within a home. And then next slide. And so we're continuing to work in this area, developing additional household models, again, expanding into probabilistic models. And we're going to be conducting studies on a real home system for flushing and other experiments. So I'll turn it back over to Walter.
Thank you, Jonathan. Let's move on to our next speaker is Miriam Bloker. Miriam.
Yeah, thank you, Walter. My name is Miriam Bloker. I work at KWR Water Research Institute in the Netherlands. So I'm the same Bloker as Sasha just mentioned, that the SimDeum model was made by, and I also will show you something about water age and temperature modeling, where I did use SimDeum as well. So a lot has already been shown. So the original thought that we had is that, well, a branch system has relatively small diameters and short lengths in houses would mean small pipe volumes, and would more or less mean that every time a tap is opened, that the pipe is emptied. So water age is really determined by the time between taps. But if you look at what actually happens, is not entirely true, because a lot of, especially at the kitchen tap, when you open the tap, there's just for a few seconds and the pipe is definitely not emptied. So the graph here shows some results of modeling. The way we did it is very similar to the previous speakers, so thank you for not having to explain that. So you can see that the travel time or water age in red could be 24 hours at the cold side of the kitchen tap, and the hot side could even be longer, which also made me realize there is a mistake in my model, in my demand model, because people would typically wait for the hot water to arrive before they close the tap again. And in the model, there is no interaction implemented. So basically, people could take really short times of water and they never really get the hot water there. So I think the model is not really true. So making this presentation made me realize that. So that was good. And we also looked at waiting times for the shower, and here you can see it takes about 1.5 minutes before the hot water arrives at the shower. So what we did think of is that we could use temperature maybe to validate water age in a model, because you cannot really measure water age. And also, I like to show you a study that was done by Iljana Stejanovic at TU Delft, when she looked at domestic fire sprinklers. So the rest of the presentation is basically about that. It's not just modeling, she also did validation. So the idea is that domestic sprinklers will be very useful in preventing fires or preventing fires from molesting or devastating the home. And what we do not want is to have an industrial sprinkler system, because it uses too much water and it would use too much pressure. And also we don't want that because it requires to be tested at least once every now and then that the water is flowing. So you actually want to test that. We don't want that for a domestic sprinkler. It should work just for always. So she had a couple of questions on how to design a sprinkler system, how to install it, and also, does it work in a conventional drinking water system, or do you need to change it? And then she did water quality measurements in an extended plumbing system. So you can read the paper if you like, where she designed and extensively measured a new design for a domestic sprinkler head, and that was very successful. So yes, that works. She thought of different ways of putting that into a drinking water installation. So you could have two separate systems, one for drinking water and one for supplying the sprinklers. You could have a combined system where at least there's part of it being connected. So in this case, the washing machine is at the end of that, so there is some continuous flow. And then there's a fully integrated system where your drinking water installation is actually being extended in such a way that you could have a sprinkler somewhere in the middle of your ceiling, and it's all connected to the same pipe system. So she built a really nice installation somewhere in TU Delft in the old elevator shaft. And then these actuators were being, they had sim demand patterns on them for a whole year of probabilistic demand. So every day that the measurement took place for more than a year, every day was different. So each day was a different unique set of tap patterns. So there was a specific tap that simulates the kitchen tap. There was a tap that simulated the washing machine and the dishwasher and so on. And we modeled what we would expect in temperature and other water quality related issues. So temperature, for example, was modeled and measured. So this validated the temperature model, which was very nicely done. And the results showed that it is possible to have the sprinkler system work and that the temperature model is able to predict the dynamics. Microbial quality parameters were taken. I have not put them in a slide because they require a lot of explanation, but we saw no difference between the two systems. So the normal plumbing system and the extended plumbing system with sprinklers, microbial water quality parameters were the same in both systems. And they were mainly related to the freshwater temperature, so not so much to the temperature after stagnation. And there was this extension, this extended plumbing system, which of course did have higher water age, but there was really negligible effects on the measured water quality parameters. Another project that we recently finished has to do with what if the temperature in your connection pipe or maybe the meter box is getting really warm, and with the energy transition, which is a really big thing in the Netherlands, we expect that more and more district heating pipes will be close to our drinking water system. So the water might be really getting warm in the connection pipe, and then you would flush that out, but how does that travel through your distribution system or through your installation? So this is what we looked at. And the graph here shows, it should show temperature. Well, anyway, we looked at the temperatures, and what you can see is that when you open the kitchen tap, the cold side, it might be such a short time that you open it that you do not really see the hot water getting there, because it's not the full pipe volume that's being flushed out at the kitchen tap. So this water travels a little bit towards the kitchen tap, but then stagnates in the pipe, and then it could cool down again. So a lot of water is getting warmed up in that connection pipe and then cooling down in your system again, and some of it might be going out the tap, but lots of it is just sitting in that system. So that might have an effect also on the biofilm in the pipes. That would be a very nice next study object. So what we see is the water age is determined by water demand and the fixtures and volume of upstream pipes and the time between water uses. And that also means that there is a flow in Simdeum for the hot water, because people will not just open the tap and then close it when they have enough water. They will close the tap after they have enough hot water. So that should be included. And water age influences interaction with pipe wall and joints and fixtures, and etc. So it has an effect on water quality. We looked at temperature. The next project we're starting on is the leaching of lead. And then biofilm growth is the next step for that. And for temperature modeling, this is an interesting thing, is that there's a difference between vertical and horizontal pipes in how fast they heat up, depending on room temperature, because convection around vertical and horizontal pipes is different. So in EPA and at MSX, we had to really set a value to each and every pipe, saying it's a horizontal or a vertical pipe. So future work that we need to do, or that we're working on, that we think is important to take into account, and maybe probably some sort of an automatic way, is determining which pipes are vertical and horizontal. We do not want to model just pipes, but also the joints. That's also where lead could be. What we would very much like to see is to have some sort of a default premise plumbing model, so we can do our simulations for, and then have some sort of a benchmark system. I saw many people making different types of typical houses, and we did too, but it makes it a little bit difficult to compare the results. So that was my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. I just wanted to point out, if those of you who are not on the chat pane, we have quite a good discussion going on there, and with questions and answers. Our fourth speaker is going to be Bill Samuels and Rakesh Bahadur.
Okay, great. Hi, hello everyone. My name is Bill Samuels. I am with Leidos in Alexandria, Virginia. Just want to acknowledge my co-author, Rakesh Bahadur, a colleague who works out of our Reston, Virginia office, and also two other members of our project team, Walter Grayman, who developed the model and performed a lot of the modeling work that you'll see today, as well as Rick Borgia from Arcadis, who did building and plumbing assessment for this project. So this project dealt with contamination modeling in high-rise buildings. It was a New York City case study. Next slide. So the goal of this assessment was to identify equipment and components of a typical domestic water distribution system in high-rises and large venues in New York City, and to understand how these systems work. So we developed some models to look at the movement of contaminants within different types of buildings. We focused, and the focus of this presentation will be on the high-rise building. We also considered in the modeling both accidental and intentional contamination events, and also contamination both from external sources as well as internal contamination. The funding for this was provided by the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, the Office of Public Health Engineering, and we work closely with their chief engineer, James Luke, in performing this study. Next slide. So the exact configurations and designs of internal plumbing systems may vary from building to building. And the potable water systems in high-rise buildings are typically divided into vertical zones. The zones are designed so that they can be served by a gravity or booster pump system while ensuring adequate pressure throughout the zone. Each zone typically encompasses about 25 floors and may not exceed 370 feet. These are New York City building guidelines. And for buildings larger than 370 feet, additional zones must be constructed. And furthermore, the zones supplied by pumps, in particular, may not exceed 300 feet. Next slide. So the figure here shows an example schematic diagram of a domestic water distribution scheme in a 43-story high-rise building using a gravity tank supplying the upper zone of the building and a pump system supplying the lower zone. This scheme is used when space for an intermediate gravity house tank is not available. Frequently, a tank is located above the bottom zone and water is pumped to that tank and then fed by gravity to the bottom zone. Next slide. If we look at gravity house tanks, they serve as the main water supply of typical high-rise buildings in New York City. Due to excessive height of high-rise buildings, it became a disadvantage to use a pump to supply and maintain the pressure and flow required for the domestic water distribution. This is especially true in very tall buildings where the use of gravity storage tanks started and has become very popular. In a typical high-rise application, gravity house tanks are used for combined service in which the domestic water and the fire water reserve are stored in the same tank. Typical capacities for gravity house tanks are from about 10,000 to 16,000 gallons per zone. And an example drawing of a gravity house tank is shown here on the left, and a photo of an actual installation on a building in New York City is shown here on the right. Next slide. So if we look at the flow and pressure characteristics, typical design flows for large commercial buildings can range from around 65 to 400 gallons per minute per service connection, depending on the number of house tanks, booster pumps, and fill pumps in a building. The length of the connection and the presence of appurtenances such as valves and fittings vary depending upon the specific local requirements and also conditions. A service connection to a building is typically designed to a maximum working pressure of about 200 psi. However, the internal plumbing fixtures and equipment are generally designed to lower working pressure. Thus, it requires a pressure reducing valve to reduce the incoming pressure before supplying the plumbing fixtures and the equipment. Next slide. So in our high-rise modeling work, in order to test the potential impacts of contamination event in a high-rise building, hydraulic models representing two generic large venue buildings were constructed using EPA net. The models were used to investigate the movement and spread of contamination for alternative contamination scenarios. And scenarios investigated included different locations for the injections and different injection quantities, durations, and times. Next slide. So here we have two profile views of the simplified model and a more detailed model. The simplified hydraulic model represents a typical generic high-rise building. The generic model, in this case, represents a 48-story building divided into a two-zone system. And this design is typical of many high-rise buildings in New York City, and it's actually based in part on the building at 457th Avenue that the project team had toured during our field trip to New York with the chief engineer. The profile of the generic model is shown on the left, and the connection to the water distribution system is represented in EPA net by the reservoir that delivers water at the designated pressure head. So two pumps located in the basement deliver water to a tank located at the top level of the building and to a mid-level tank. And in order to provide sufficient pressure to the 3 floors immediately below each tank, an inline booster pump is located adjacent to each tank. For the detailed model on the right, so to examine the impacts associated with injection of contaminants at various fixtures within the system, a more detailed model was constructed that you can see here on the right. And so these changes included a number of things. First off, representing pressure reducing valves located every 3 floors, a parallel pipe around the PRV that simulates the movement of water backwards through the PRV if the downstream pressure exceeds the upstream pressure, and this is required by the EPA net model. And also a check valve on the outlet of the tanks in order to preclude backflow into the tank. And finally, a inclusion of a movable tank and pump combination representing the 55-gallon drum and injection pump used to contaminate the system. Next slide. So the water use here in this diagram represents a diurnal water use pattern that has been assumed for all floors. As illustrated, most usage occurs during the period from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. with lowering water use during the night, corresponding to cleaning, boiler use, and other building operations. Next slide. So we developed 3 high-rise scenarios. Actually, there were more than that, but I'm just going to talk about these 3 due to our time constraints. First of all, there was external contamination of the distribution system, and in this case, it was 400 milligram per liter concentration inflow for 3 hours starting at noon. There was an internal contamination of a roof tank, a 200 milligram per liter instantaneous contamination starting at midnight. And then finally, the third scenario was an internal contamination event, 55 gallons injected over a 2-hour period on the 27th floor of this building. And there were 2 cases that I'll talk about here. One was a low head pump or a cross connection, and the second was a high head pump. Next slide. So let's talk about that first scenario and a little bit of the results here. So as illustrated by the pump flow and the water levels in this slide, during the nighttime when water usage in the building is very low, little water is used from the tanks, and as a result, the pumps do not need to be operated to fill the tanks. With the increased demand when the workday starts, the water levels in the tanks quickly drop in the pump cycle on around 7 a.m. The resulting concentration in the roof tank is shown here in the lower left. So as illustrated here, the concentration is above the assumed LD50, which was set to 100 milligrams per liter in this case for approximately 6 hours. It then dropped to a lower concentration as the tank subsequently refilled with clean water. And as illustrated, a spike in concentration in the tank resulted in an increase from 135 to 155 milligrams per liter, and that occurred around hour 18. Which is about 3 hours after the initial contamination period ended. This behavior was caused by the residual contamination that remained in the riser pipe after the pump was shut off about 1:30 p.m. Next slide. Continuing on with this scenario, but now looking at concentrations at the nodes, as water is consumed in the upper half of the building, the contaminated water is drawn from the roof tank and delivered to the fixtures on the affected floors. The progression of the floors impacted by the contamination and the resulting concentrations are shown here. So this figure shows snapshots of the building at 1 p.m., 2 p.m., and 5 p.m., representing 1 hour, 2 hours, and 5 hours after the start of the contamination event. And as expected, no contaminated water is delivered to the lower floors served by the mid-level tank. Next slide. Okay, can we move to the next one? Scenario B.
I changed it. It's
Okay.
just catching
Okay.
up, I think.
Sorry. So here we're looking at the second scenario where there was a tank concentration here on this curve. So in this example, the top tank is instantaneously contaminated at midnight, resulting in a concentration that is twice the LD50 in this example. So as illustrated in this figure, because of the low water usage during the night, the pumps do not operate and the concentration in the tank remains at the same value until about 7 a.m. when the pumps start in order to refill the tank. That results in a drop in concentration throughout the day due to dilution. Next slide. Okay, so this is the final scenario, and we're just looking at nodal concentrations here. In this scenario, on the left here, a low head pump is used to inject the contents of the 55-gallon drum over a period of 2 hours starting at noon. The movable tank and pump combination is attached to a fixture such as a utility sink on the 27th floor. The pump is capable of overcoming the pressure on the downstream side of the PRV, but cannot overcome the pressure on the upstream side. As shown in the figure on the left, as a result, all the contaminant affects the water usage on floors 25, 26, and 27 served by the PRV on floor 27. In the next case, shown on the right, a higher head pump is used that is capable of overcoming the pressure on the upstream side of the PRV. However, as long as the demand on the downstream side of the PRV, which is associated with the usage on floors 25, 26, and 27, exceeds the rate at which the contaminant is injected into the fixture, the contaminant will stay within the 3-floor zone and not affect the other floors. When the water usage on floors 25, 26, and 27 are set to 0, only then will the contaminant move through the PRV in the main riser. So as shown in this figure, when the contaminant enters the riser, it will mix with the water that is coming from the tank and move with the flow, i.e., towards lower floors, resulting in contaminated water feeding those floors. Next slide. So just to summarize, hydraulic models proved to be useful for estimating the spread of the contaminant and the resulting human exposures. And several different scenarios were modeled for the high-rise and also low-rise buildings, which I did not present here, to demonstrate the likely consequences of various contamination schemes. So impacts depended upon the location of the entry point, the duration of the event, the time of the event, and the quantity of contaminant introduced into the system. And with respect to future work to continue these types of studies, there would need to be additional information defining the demand patterns. We had a very simple demand pattern here, defining the range of operations and designs of these buildings. We did not look at, we only looked at a small handful of buildings, high rises in New York, looking at additional scenarios and then verification and validation of assumptions and results. Thank you very much. And Walter, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Bill. There we go. This one is on residential contaminant modeling. And it's based on a study that Steve Buckberger and Steve is at University of Cincinnati. I'm a consulting engineer in Oakland, California. A study that we did in 2006, and there are a couple of references that describe in a little more detail what we did. This was in the era when water security was a big issue. And the purpose was to demonstrate the calculation of human exposure patterns from a hypothetical contamination event and its impact within the house. We wanted to look at and demonstrate different methodologies for logging water use within a house, and also as a proof of concept for modeling movement of a contaminant through a house. Remember, this was almost 15 years ago. We did 2 case studies. The first one was really a manual application using spreadsheet. And the second one was an EPA-NET application, more similar to what we've been hearing today. In case study number 1, I used my house as the example. We logged all water use manually for a week. Put together a house plumbing schematic, defined a hypothetical contamination event, routed contaminants to each fixture, and calculated exposures for individuals. The fact manually is that it was a tree structure, as most houses are, and we could then use a Lagrangian routing technique in a spreadsheet to quite easily make those calculations. So here is the plumbing schematic. I'm showing only the cold water system. We just simulated the cold water system. We did represent the hot water as a demand going into the hot water heater, since that draws water into the building. As I mentioned, we manually logged every water use for a week. My wife did not appreciate that, but and this is an example logging sheet where we were at the time, the fixture, the purpose, the temperature, and an approximation of the duration or quantity. This was transferred to a spreadsheet, and really an event-based one, which allowed us to do the calculations as the water moved through the system towards each one of the demand-oriented events. Contamination scenario we used was a 12-hour duration on day 1, starting at 9 a.m. at the street and ending at 12 hours later. So I'll do a very quick little animation and just show it as this is a start. We see at the street, it's contaminated, and various events occur. It's a fairly long driveway, so it took 9 hours for the contaminated water actually to reach the building. And then as various uses were taking place, it was drawing it into the building. I'm showing only example events. And at 2100, 12 hours later, the contamination ends, and continue to do the routing as the clean water enters the building. And it was 27 hours after the start. No contamination remains in the house in the cold water system. We did various statistics in terms of the amount of water that was used, the amount of water was consumed, the amount of water that was contaminated, and the exposure by 2 different people. And as I indicated, it took 9 hours for the water to actually reach the building, and then an additional 15 hours before it was totally clear. And we feel this demonstrated the feasibility of modeling contaminant movement in the house. Case study 2 was the more sophisticated one, and Steve used continuous logging of total water use in the house, determined the house plumbing schematic, disaggregated the water use to the fixtures, defined a similar hypothetical event, and then routed the contaminant plume to and through the house to each fixture in EPA-NET and calculated some statistics. These are some results from a very well-known study that Steve did back in the early part of the century in Milford, Ohio, and it shows the indoor water use during the month of October. And he went through some various mechanisms for simulating a disaggregated daily hot and cold water demands, and then into a stochastic fixture level water use. And I'm sure he'll be talking about this a lot more at next month's webinar. This is the plumbing schematic, and this is both the hot, shown in red, and the blue, shown in cold, in the house. Again, at 9 a.m., the 12-hour contamination started. We show it then 12 hours later, as it's moving through the house. The red is the cold water system. It's showing a concentration of 1 milligram per liter, which is what entered it, and it doesn't change. In the hot water system, it decreases because of mixing within the hot water tank. And then by 9 p.m., it's cleared from the cold water system, but continues on in the hot water system. These two plots are a time plot of the concentration. The blue line is at the node right where the hot water heater comes off, and as we see, it's a pulse, whereas in the hot water in that tank, we have this diminishing as it mixes, and then the amount of concentration decreases over time. Various statistics that were calculated in terms of the contaminant mass delivered to the cold water fixtures. So conclusions, we felt this was a good proof of concept for modeling contaminants from the main to the house fixtures. It demonstrated both a very simplistic manual water logging method and a continuous automated logging. It gave us really different results when compared to some of the exposure analyses that were done where you're assuming that the water reaching the house or reaching the connection. We find that it differs quite a bit when you actually look at how it affects the residents. And at that time, we said the methodology should be extended to other applications. So in terms of needed future work, as several people have noted, a stochastic representation of fixture level demands, water quality transformations in piping systems, various things related to hydraulic processes, pipe dispersion, hot water heating mixing. And since we did everything manually in terms of building the model, integration with CAD and BIM systems to facilitate network construction and display results. And at the bottom thing, what we felt quite strongly is that there needs to be very close interaction between modelers and practicing engineers and plumbers, something that we feel that our task committee has representing. Before going to the discussion, I just wanted to bring up a paper that Tom Walsky gave at our first webinar in April, in which he did a similar type of analysis with modeling premise plumbing. He was using the proprietary Water Gems model, and he constructed manually a model of a house, 3-story house, and then modeled water age on the left, showing the time series of water age on the top floor, and the right being a snapshot of the water age throughout the house. So that brings the end to our presentations. We have about 20 minutes now and somewhat structured discussion. There's 3 topics that I'd like to cover. First of all, what is future research and development needs? What are the gaps and needs? I'm going to ask the question, have we missed anything? And then finally, what's next? And time permitting, we'll see if we can bring some people in on these discussion. So I took the results from the 5 presentations and tried to summarize what was said in terms of needs. Most of the presenters mentioned demand estimation and the need for a fixture level stochastic demand. We're going to hear a lot more about that in next month's webinar. Water quality transformations in piping systems, pipes, joints, microbial regrowth, etc. Hydraulic processes, some that were mentioned, pipe dispersion, and hot water heater mixing, which has quite a bit of effect on the water age and contamination going through hot water heaters, looping systems, which are starting to come in residents, and no flow periods. How does that affect things? Household models, looking for default models and additional household scenarios and features for different types of homes. Some model applications that were mentioned, a probabilistic exposure assessment study for lead and Legionella in homes and buildings, and also evaluating home and building flushing routines following contamination incidents. And most of these are going to be addressed further in our later webinars. Define the range of operations and designs of buildings. Verification and validation of assumptions and results. This hasn't been done that much, and as modelers, we recognize that need. And finally, integration with CAD and BIM to facilitate network construction and display results, and 3D modeling and display of vertical and horizontal pipes. At this point, I'd like to take maybe the next 10 minutes and open up, and let's just brainstorm on what are some of the other gaps and needs. And so go ahead and let's hope we don't get a free-for-all, but if you'd like to make a contribution, I will try and capture it here on the screen. So just open up your mic and go ahead.
This is Jim Lutz.
Take a break or
Can you
Jim,
hear me?
yes.
I would like to suggest working with the energy simulation modeling community. They've doing pretty exciting modeling of energy in buildings and also air quality in the buildings. And they've been working on it around the world. They're I don't know, they've been going for a couple of decades now, but they don't seem to be touching water at all, just barely hot water.
Okay, thank you. And there is one of our later webinars is hot water, and that's scheduled currently for January 2021. Next.
Yeah, this is Ron George. I have a question. Does this beg the need for filtration at the source at the building entrance for premise plumbing systems? It seems that the contamination can often come from fire events or some sort of surge flow in the water main that dislodges a large quantity of bacteria, and that seems to be what doses building systems with bacteria that often leads to Legionella and other bacterial growth issues in the systems.
Okay. Next.
This is Gary Klein. I think we need to have standardized layouts for different occupancies so that our results are comparable with different modeling technique. And the same for standardized water use patterns. I would recommend that we look at the extremes, if you will, the ranges of use patterns and layouts, and spend our time modeling the boundaries and analyzing for the boundaries, and then checking in the middle, rather than doing all different categories of things. It's just too many. The patterns are too many to play with. So we need to do range bounding or something like that in order to keep our work reasonable in time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Next.
Tim Bartran here, along with what Gary just proposed. If there are standardized layouts and patterns, we'd need data that go with those. Data of all sorts, the water quality data, tracer data, but data for validating if everybody's using the same layouts.
Yeah, and to go along with the standardized layouts, I would also add that the high-rise buildings seem to have a plethora of different designs that waste energy but are cheap to install. So I think the design needs to take into consideration the energy cost versus the first cost. I think in some of these buildings, you need to spend a little money up front to make sure that you save energy over the life of the building. Because some of these buildings that use the roof tank end up causing you to have a much larger structure in the building. But then they create a condition where you're using pressure reducing valves in a building, and I call pressure reducing valves or energy wasting valves is what those should be called, because you can design a building with no pressure reducing valves.
Right. Any more? There will be many opportunities over the coming months for people to provide additional input or become involved.
This is Jim again. It might be good to set up a laboratory house, or model what's happening in a house in a laboratory, so that all the parameters and dimensions are well known and well controlled, and see what the dispersion does for both temperature and contaminants, so that you have a validated, a real data set that you can build your models and see if they get the same results before you start working on trying to match what else is going on in the world.
Right, and I think we may hear, I think some of that may have been done.
But if that data set and the parameters and the dimensions could be shared widely, then all the modelers can be, exercising their models on the same data set and seeing how well they can do it.
Got it.
This is Miriam. So I agree with standardized layouts, but please be aware that there could be differences between US, Europe, Asia, Australia.
Well, it's not just geographical differences, it's also temporal differences. When was the building built? What codes was it used? What were the building styles in use at that time? And within the US, there's dramatic regional variations as well in housing styles.
A lot of it has to do with piping materials and pressure ratings of different materials. And different countries will have different materials and different pressure ratings for different wall thicknesses for the different materials.
There's another point related to the materials. In the US, most domestic plumbing that I'm familiar with is based on copper tube size equivalent piping, not the schedule numbers that are used in other applications in buildings. So the copper tube size pipe has a standardized outside diameter, and the inside diameter varies based on the material that's used to make the pipe. I'm not convinced that that's true elsewhere. And so when we talk about 1/2 inch nominal or something with a similar number, 12 millimeters or 15 millimeters, whatever that number is, we need to make sure we are clear across cultures here. What do we mean by the pipe size? And I think that having some standardized tables that we all agree to and compare, I know they're in the literature, I get that, we're presenting that information as this is what I mean by the pipe, we ought to be really clear, because we're trying to compare results from different places. Related to the pipes, emissivity varies greatly between the materials of the pipes. In the conductivity of the material itself varies, but when you put pipes in a building, we typically don't have them touching the building very much. So conductivity to the building is probably very different than the conductivity of the inside to the outside wall of the pipe. And so I think we need to do some more work looking at that to make sure our models track correctly.
Any more?
Yeah, Jim Lutz again. Gary's been doing a lot of interesting work on pressure drop through fittings. At least in the US, there's no standard method of rating the pressure drop through a fitting. And the data that does exist is decades and maybe even almost a century old. So it doesn't really match the new materials and techniques that are being used. And if you're talking about flow through pipes with lots of fittings, you need to know what's going on in the fittings.
I would add that the same is true through our shower valves, our faucets. Each group of regulations creates different products to meet them. And we need to have a better understanding of what we mean by a shower valve or a fitting when we're talking about it across all of the work that we're doing here.
This webinar was concentrating on really what has been done in the past in terms of water age modeling and contaminant modeling. And so I'm going to pose the question, what have we missed? And here I'm really looking for other modeling studies that have been done of residents or large venues. So if there are some other ones you're aware of, if you could just let me know. We do want to have as complete information for our chapter as possible. We would encourage everyone to become involved in the work of the task committee. If you are interested in this particular focus area, water age and contaminant modeling in houses, you can contact me directly at that email address. For any other things related to the task committee, we'll use our chair, June Suk Lee, as the point of contact. If you want to become added to our email list, if you're not on it, or if you want to participate or attend future monthly webinars. I was asked, Tanya Ula of NIST asked me just to mention a report that just came out a month ago or so that NIST put out on measurement science research needs for premise plumbing systems. And it was based on a workshop that took place a couple of years ago. And that report is available. You can see the URL there where you can get that report. And if you have additional questions, I'm sure Tanya would be happy to address them. Her email is shown here. I hope that she will be able to give one of the presentations at our future webinars. And finally, the next webinar, Modeling Water Demands in Premise Plumbing Models. That's going to be led by Steve Buckberger and Miriam Blocher. They're in the process of, I think, finalizing the agenda for that. If there's something you want to become involved in, you can contact them directly. It's exactly a month from now. I think that's been set. Steve, has that date been set definitely?
That's right, Walter. 1 month from now, Thursday, July 30th.
Anything you'd like to add about that?
It's still in the process of working it out, but as soon as we've got it finalized, we'll put the advertisement out so people can get it on their calendar.
Excellent. And future ones, and if you would like to be involved in any of those, give a presentation or just attend or be in the discussion, please let us know. In terms of follow-up from this, we will be making the slides available in PDF form and distributing those. And we'll be turning the recording into a video, and we'll put that up on YouTube, and we will provide you the link. At this point, we haven't decided whether we're going to make those totally public or whether we're just going to make them. If you have the link, you can access them. But we will make that available sometime in the next week to everyone. With that, if there's anybody who has a last word, June Suk, do you have anything you'd like to say about the task committee?
Again, thank you very much for the great webinar today. And also, we are very happy that over 80 people joined today. So, and also again, if you interested in the committee work or the presentation, please feel free to contact me. And also for the water quality webinar, please contact Walter. So, yep, that's it. I'm very happy today.